You know, when you really stop and think about how we memorialize historical figures, we usually rely on these freeze frames.
Right, like a guy on a bronze horse with a sword in the air.
Exactly. Or, a marble figure sitting in a giant chair in a massive echoing temple. It is an entirely static exercise. We take one specific, highly sanitized moment in time, we set it in stone, and that solitary image is meant to tell the definitive, all-encompassing story of a human being.
Which is a comforting, albeit highly curated approach to history. I mean, we prefer our historical narratives to be neat, easily categorized and firmly cast in bronze, so they never really shift or demand reinterpretation.
Yeah, totally.
Looking at a statue provides the illusion that you fully comprehend the entirety of what that person represented to the world.
But how do you exhibit a life that was constantly redefining itself? Because that is the massive narrative puzzle we are solving today for you on this deep dive. Our mission is to explore a March 2026 dispatch from a travel blogger who goes by Red Solo Traveler.
A writer named Louis, right?
Yeah, right. And he recently spent time at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta. Through his boots-on-the-ground perspective, we are going to extract insights about how a museum attempts to memorialize a man whose 100-year life, and specifically his sprawling post-presidential legacy, completely overshadows his actual time as the 39th president. Okay, let's unpack this. Jimmy Carter passed away on December 29th, 2024, at the remarkable age of 100.
Wow.
I know, right? That is an entire century of American history, lived, breathed, and actively shaped.
Trying to capture a century of constant, evolving motion inside a single physical building is a monumental architectural and curatorial challenge.
Like that.
Yeah, because if we look at the standard template for these institutions, presidential libraries are fundamentally designed to cement a political legacy. They are monuments dedicated almost exclusively to a specific 4 or 8 year term in the executive branch.
Right, the highlight reel.
Exactly. But the source material reveals a space that really pushes back against that convention. Louise's blog post describes a museum that tries to capture a much broader, highly complicated human arc rather than just, to single term in office.
And Louis' blog points out how the museum physically surrounds you with Carter's origins, focusing heavily on what we can call the ground game.
The ground game, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, the curation skips the standard, dry timeline of dates and resumes. Instead of just reminding you that Carter grew up on a Plains, Georgia peanut farm, went to the Naval Academy, and eventually became governor in 1971, the exhibits actually force you to inhabit the complex post-Civil War landscape of his childhood.
Which is such a specific and important environment.
It really is. The blogger was just captivated by how the museum actively compares Jimmy's progressive shift against the deep traditionalism of his father. His dad, James Carter Sr., was also a politician in the Georgia House of Representatives.
And the curation makes a very deliberate choice to emphasize that generational and ideological friction. The physical space doesn't present a simple, idyllic, agrarian childhood.
Right, it's not just a happy little farm story.
No, not at all. It meticulously lays out the vastly different mental landscapes of the father and the son. You have James Sr., whose perspectives and worldview were deeply entrenched in a recovering, highly traditional South.
Okay.
And then you have Jimmy, who was raised in that exact same soil, but whose worldview begins to diverge sharply, especially after his exposure to a broader, more modernized world during his military service.
It is the friction that makes the spark, Instead of just passively absorbing his environment, the exhibits show a young man actively deciding what pieces of his father's legacy to graft onto his own life and, what pieces to leave behind in the dirt.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It feels like an exhibit about the mechanics of personal ideology. You are watching him reconcile the deep community ties of a small farming town with the modern perspective of a naval officer. It's almost like a superhero origin story, like a training montage.
A training montage.
Yeah. Sometimes the gritty training montage of a person's life, the ground game, is just way more compelling than the big battle they eventually fight.
What's fascinating here is why the blogger found this pre-presidential buildup to be the absolute most compelling part of the entire library. The curation successfully explains the causality of his later life.
Okay, how so?
Well, it demonstrates to the visitor that Carter's progressive reforms as governor of Georgia were not standard political maneuvering. They weren't just focus grouped talking points,
Right, they came from somewhere real.
Exactly. They were a direct, deliberate reaction to his specific upbringing and the ideological tension with his father. It grounds his political ideology, making it deeply personal rather than merely transactional.
But that hyper-individualized grassroots mindset you just described that doesn't scale easily, when he takes that farm-learned idealism into the highest office in the land in 1977, it immediately hits a bureaucratic brick wall.
Oh, absolutely.
Which the museum maps out remarkably well, I might add, transitioning us from the dirt of the peanut farm right into the architecture of legacy itself.
And the physical space mirrors that exact transition. Louis details the library's physical footprint on the John Lewis Freedom Parkway in Atlanta. It opened in 1986.
Right.
And the blog note's a really critical piece of historical context. This was the very first facility built under the 1955 Presidential Libraries Act.
And that 1955 Act completely shifted the paradigm of how we archive the executive branch. Before that, a president's papers were essentially their private hoard, right?
Yeah, they literally just boxed them up and took them home.
Exactly. They could burn them, hide them, or sell them to the highest bidder. But the Act standardized a system where private funds are raised to build the monument, but the federal government, specifically the National Archives, steps in to maintain it and run the research side.
It created the modern template of a hybrid public archive and private monument.
Yep. And the building features striking modern architecture that integrates into the surrounding landscape. It houses both a massive research room for scholars and, of course, the requisite replica Oval Office for the public.
Because you have to have the replica Oval Office.
You have to. But the psychological shift happens when the blogger walks into the central exhibits detailing the administration's single term from 1977 to 1981. And just to be completely clear to you listening, as we walk through this specific portion of the exhibits, we are remaining strictly neutral.
Absolutely neutral.
We are simply relaying the historical summary and curation exactly as it was provided in Louis' travel blog. We are looking at the museum's design, not endorsing a political verdict.
Right. The blogger notes that the museum presents a straightforward, often jarring dichotomy of that 4-year term.
Jarring how?
Well, the exhibits physically place massive foreign policy achievements like the Camp David Accords and the normalization of diplomatic relations with China in stark contrast with grinding, compounding crises.
Oh, I see.
The visitor is immediately confronted with the severe realities of the late 1970s energy crisis and the Iran hostage situation, the very challenges that ultimately culminated in his 1980 defeat.
So what does this all mean? Because Louis arrives at a very harsh verdict here. He claims that when the museum transitions into this presidential portion, it loses some of its allure and becomes rather mediocre.
That is a strong word to use for a museum exhibit.
It is, and I have to push back on the blogger's theory that this is a failure of exhibit design. I wonder if that mediocre or bogged-down feeling is actually an intentional, brilliant architectural choice.
Oh, that's an interesting take.
Think about it. What if the curators deliberately designed the space to feel dense, text-heavy, and claustrophobic to mirror the bureaucratic bog of the 1970s Oval Office, especially when compared to the wide-open dynamic exhibits of his Georgia farm days?
This raises an important question about the inherent nature of presidential libraries and the curatorial perspective behind them. You are always experiencing the presidency through a highly autobiographical lens.
Sure, it's their own story.
It is a self-curated exhibit, and presidents naturally frame their own narratives.
Yeah.
Yet what Louis finds unique here is that the museum does not shy away from the severe difficulties and mistakes of the term. It doesn't just showcase the best days at work.
Because you were trapped in the machine. When he was a farmer or hands-on governor, he had direct causal agency. He was the mechanic, you know.
Right.
But the presidency exhibits force the visitor to feel what it's like to just be a gear in a massive, slow-moving geopolitical machine.
And the sudden drop in momentum that Louis experienced stems directly from that jarring shift. The transition from Carter the dynamic, boots-on-the-ground individual to Carter the constrained executive is physically felt in the room.
Wow, yeah.
The idealistic ground game is swallowed by deeply entrenched global economic forces and a slow-moving legislative branch. The magic of his early life, that personal agency, gets suffocated by the institution of the presidency itself.
It makes complete sense that a visitor would feel bogged down in those rooms. The reality of the presidency is infinitely more bureaucratic and frustrating than the narrative of a renegade governor.
Definitely.
But because the traditional presidential exhibits intentionally or unintentionally feel like a dip in the narrative, the most vibrant, successful part of Jimmy Carter's legacy actually escapes the physical walls of the museum entirely.
It does. The historical narrative literally spills out of the Federal Archive and into the parking lot.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Louis casually mentions spotting signs for a farmer's market during his visit, and he discovers that the Freedom Farmers Market operates year-round every single Saturday morning right there on the grounds of the Presidential Library.
Which is just such a wild detail to stumble across.
Think about how jarring that juxtaposition is. Finding a bustling, noisy tomato stand operating at a highly secure, federally maintained archive feels like a zoning violation. It is as absurd as finding a batting cage on the steps of the Supreme Court.
It really is a wonderfully disruptive detail,
Yeah.
but honestly, it represents the ultimate thematic victory for a former peanut farmer.
Yes.
And the source makes it clear this is not some casual folding table operation in the corner of a lot. It is a robust, deeply embedded community fixture.
Louis paints this incredible sensory picture that completely contrasts with the sterile quiet of the archive research rooms. Visitors are walking through stalls of fresh, seasonal produce, artisanal goods, and homemade baked goods. There is live music playing.
I love that.
Right. The air smells like fresh food and coffee. People are laughing and talking. And crucially, the market goes far beyond just weekend commerce. It features active educational workshops and demonstrations.
That's a really vital point.
Yeah, people are literally standing in the shadow of a presidential monument, learning about sustainable farming practices, seasonal cooking techniques, and the economic necessity of supporting local agriculture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this functional market is the crucial key to understanding the sheer scale of his post-presidency. After leaving the Oval Office in 1981, Carter did not retreat into private wealth or corporate boardrooms.
Which is the standard playbook, right?
Exactly. It's what almost everyone else does. But he dedicated the next 4 decades of his life to grassroots humanitarian work, building houses, monitoring global elections, eradicating diseases. And all of these efforts eventually earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002.
He went right back to the ground game.
Exactly. So when Louis looks at the Freedom Farmers Market, he isn't just looking at a place to buy vegetables. He is looking at a living exhibit.
Oh, I like that phrase. A living exhibit.
The market is actively fostering the exact type of community support, agricultural education, and social connection that defined Carter's life outside of Washington, D.C. It is a mechanism for community resilience, operating as a functional extension of his own ethos.
I really want you, the listener, to consider how this entirely challenges our default view of what a legacy actually is. When we think of historical legacy, we are conditioned to think of those quiet, sterile research rooms. We picture locked glass cases, whispered voices, and marble statues.
The freeze frames you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. But this dispatch from Atlanta suggests that a noisy, slightly chaotic community space, a place where real people are learning how to grow food and support their neighbors, might actually be a vastly more accurate reflection of a life's work than any declassified document behind glass.
It illustrates the profound difference between merely preserving a memory and actively continuing a mission. The physical library, managed by the National Archives, meticulously preserves the memory of the presidency. But the market, managed by the community, continues the mission of the man.
We have mapped out quite a journey today through the lens of Red Solo Traveler. We started in the post-Civil War dirt of a Georgia farm, exploring how friction and environment forge a uniquely progressive mindset.
Right.
We navigated the constrained, text-heavy complexities of the Oval Office exhibits, realizing that the presidency is often a bureaucratic cage legacy that absolutely refuses to be confined to a building, celebrated instead through a vibrant, functional weekend market.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought that builds on the 1955 Presidential Libraries Act we discussed earlier.
Okay, lay it on us.
That act set the precedent for the modern system of memorialization. It formalized the process of building massive, privately funded static archives to house political legacies. And yet, if the most universally beloved, effectively captivating aspect of the Carter Memorial is a local, highly functional farmers market, well, it demands that we rethink the future of these monuments entirely.
It makes you wonder if the entire blueprint is flawed.
Should future leaders abandon the idea of building grand, self-serving museum monuments? Instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars funding massive static archives of their own political glory, perhaps true public servants should be required to memorialize themselves by funding active, everyday community spaces.
Wow. Yeah.
Imagine if the legacy of a president wasn't a museum you visit once on a middle school field trip, but a sprawling public park, a fully funded agricultural school, or a permanent market that actually serves the people on a daily basis long after their term ends.
Instead of demanding that we look back at a freeze frame of their past, they build a space that helps the community look forward. You can try to cast a life in bronze and put it on a pedestal, but eventually the bronze is going to tarnish. A community market where people are actively feeding each other, that just keeps growing. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of legacy, and we'll catch you on the next one.